We're going to look at tuning mods for a BMW, what the best mods are. We're going to look at the history of BMW and how they got to where they are today. And we're going to discuss some of the pitfalls and advantages and pros and cons of tuning your BMW. And we're going to look at their special edition models, the Alpina and the M Series, and just see what it is that makes those models stand out. So we hear from quite a few BMW owners. We've got quite a few BMW owning members in our forum, and they're a great group of people. They really love their cars. It would really help though to look at the history of BMW, because that helps us to understand where they're coming from as a company and why they make such extremely good engines. So please throw us up a like. It really helps us to get out there if people like our videos and if people comment on it. So BMW, or Bavarian Motorwerk, or
Bayerische Motorenwerke.
My German's not very good, so you'll have to bear with me on the pronunciation. They didn't actually start making cars. The first things they made were aircraft engines. Now, with an aircraft, you want the engine to be supremely reliable, well balanced, and it needs to work at fairly high RPMs and be quite an efficient engine. And we see those characteristics of reliability and smooth running coming through in their car engines even today. That heritage that they've established for themselves has become part of BMW's DNA. So after the aircraft exploits that they had and the engines they built, they got into building motorcycles. So they were predominantly a motorcycle company. But as the people's love of the motorcycle started to ebb and fade and they were more enthusiastic about motor cars, BMW started producing the motor car. And this really gets us on the path where we are today.
You may think of BMWs as being purely naturally aspirated, but actually the first mass production of a BMW turbocharged engine started in 2006. In recent times they did offer a turbo vehicle, the 1672 BMW 2002, between 1973 and 1975. After 2010, most BMW engines switched over to turbocharged technology for enhanced power, because these engines were smaller, they were lighter, but they enabled BMW to meet emissions regulations and still retain their performance. We note that a lot of the turbos on BMW engines are actually designed to respond like large naturally aspirated engines. They've minimised the lag that you would normally get with a turbo, and they've smoothed out the power delivery.
So the M series of BMWs are really nicely tuned and nicely set up. So BMW typically take the standard model and they improve it. They rework the suspension, they rework the cam profile, they add power, they use better turbochargers. Everything in the car is optimized and taken to the next level. So the downside is, if you've got an M series engine, a lot of the easy mods that you would otherwise do to your car have already been done from the factory. So you're just looking to make further improvements to that. So with Alpina, we've got a very specialist company there that was set up, and their whole aim was to take a production line ready BMW and remanufacture it, creating the ultimate driver's car. So they did this in a number of ways. They had very limited models, but they did their research and development very carefully. Generally speaking, the Alpina suspension is softer than you would get on a BMW. It aids the handling and the driver's enjoyment of the car. The more modern versions with electronically adjustable suspension have got different options that reflect the need for comfort and being sedate. But they add so much more power to these engines. They use larger turbos, they use twin turbos, they change the mapping, they change the cam profile, the exhausts are completely reworked. They do everything they can to make the car better. So just by following the lead set by BMW in their M division and Alpina, we can do a lot to the standard BMWs. So over the years, BMW have produced some fantastic engines and some fantastic cars, but like most manufacturers, they've also produced a few duds that are best avoided, if we're completely honest.
So the more recent turbo versions that have come out are really stunning. The 335i was our car of the year, thanks mainly to its supremely tunable N54 and even the later N55 engine. These engines can handle around 800 horsepower on stock internals, and most owners can achieve a 100 brake horsepower power gain relatively easily. Interestingly, BMW ditched the twin turbo setup and they went with the twin scroll turbo setup, and power output and performance is very similar between both versions. options, but a lot of people say you can get more out of a twin turbo setup, and the upgrades for the twin turbos also help you to achieve higher power figures in the long run. But technology is moving on, and there's a lot of upgrades for the N55 as well that can take it up to those levels easily. What are some of the options you've got to improve the performance of your BMW? Well, it makes sense to follow the lead set by Alpina and the M versions, where they tend to use more aggressive cams. Turbos are uprated, they improve the head, the airflow into the engine, the valves, the suspension and handling is also improved, and they adjust the gearing in the gearbox.
So with BMW tuning, we're starting to look at ways of improving the car's performance and its handling. So the car has been set up quite nicely from the factory. You're just looking to come in and make improvements to that standard setup. So one of the most common mods that people do to their BMW when they first get it is to ditch those run flats. Run flats are big and heavy, expensive to replace, and they don't do much to enhance the performance of your BMW. You're better off replacing the alloy wheels. Don't go too large on the alloy wheels. I'm always banging on about avoiding big wheels. So on paper in the dry, you will get better performance from a larger wheel. But in reality, in everyday driving and wet conditions, the smaller rim sizes give you better grip, better control and better handling.
This is primarily down to the profile and size of the tyre that's fitted to those rims, but make sure that the rim is lighter. There's a lot of really nice looking rims around for your BMW that are much lighter than the factory originals.
So bear in mind how you're going to be using the car. If you're building an ultimate track day car that's just going to be used in the dry, then you've got a completely different approach to your needs than you would have if you're just trying to build the ultimate road car BMW. But it's only really the recent BMWs that are able to be remapped, and that's really where you start unlocking a lot of power from the engine, particularly if it's a petrol turbocharged engine. Even the diesel turbocharged engines give you a lot more power when you start looking at remaps. So things are always moving on when it comes to ECU mapping, and with BMW it's no exception. So a few years ago, a boot mod 3 was pretty much the only way of getting the ECU unlocked and getting it into a state where you could alter the parameters within the car's computer. But in recent times they've unlocked a lot of the ECUs on BMWs, so the more conventional flash mapping through the OBD2 port, they seem to be going back on some of the older engines that have proved to be more popular and looking for ways of mapping those. So in recent times most of the modern BMW engines can be remapped, but for some of those earlier models that can't be remapped, you've got the option of a piggyback ECU that completely takes over from the ECU and does all the work, all the calculations. It will successfully increase the fueling, advance the spark as required or retard it as necessary, and just make sure that the engine is running at its peak performance and you get the maximum power from it. So remaps are definitely a significant mod. One of the other mods that you see a lot on the Alpinas and M series BMWs is the cam profile has changed. So on a stock BMW it makes a lot of sense to just see if there's a performance cam option out there. So dropping in a performance cam can actually give you about 10% more power in a lot of cases. So again, we need to do our research, but adding a performance cam will make significant power gains, especially on a naturally aspirated BMW engine. While you're adding power, you may as well think about reducing weight. So the cars are quite heavy relatively. The setup from the factory, they aim at a 50-50 weight distribution, which makes the handling nice. They're never spot on 50-50, but they get pretty close and they really do make the ultimate driver's car. But just taking out some of the weight can actually do the same thing as adding significant amounts more power and improving the handling. So it's essentially a free mod if you just cut some of the weight from the car wherever you can. So replacing some of the panels and everything that can be replaced with lighter carbon fibre or fiberglass alternatives can make a big difference to the weight of the car overall.
So most of the BMW engines were silky smooth. So one mod that we see commonly carried out is fitting a lighter flywheel. Now that's not suited to all engines, and in many cases you only want a slight drop in flywheel weight, but it will make the engine rev more freely. So while not adding more power, it does improve the responsiveness of the engine.
So thinking about the stopping power of the car, most BMWs that I've driven have actually got pretty good brakes, but I understand there are a few out there that need quite a bit of extra help in the braking and stopping department. So think about upgrading the brakes. So vented, drilled, grooved discs will all make a big difference to the brake's ability to dissipate the car's momentum as heat and eradicate that. But don't overlook the power of a decent set of pads. Just changing out the pads on a stock brake for a slightly better performing pad can make a big difference to your BMW stopping power. So think carefully about the grade of pad you use. You don't want to go with a race pad, because race pads require a lot of heat before they bite. They're designed for that upper end of the operating temperature, and you just won't hit that on everyday driving. Well, most drivers won't hit that in everyday driving. If you're enjoying your car, having a spirited drive at the weekend, there's probably an argument that you will need that. So improving the handling of your BMW, so with coilovers that allow you to adjust the ride height, and if you're lucky you get a good quality set and you can adjust the spring rates and various other geometry alignments on the suspension, you can do a lot to improve the overall handling and cornering of the car. So if your BMW is starting to get old, you can probably bet that the rubber bushings on the suspension mounts have started to wear and degrade, and that's going to exhibit knocking noises and other problems with the handling. So if you start to get knocking noises, or the car's just not sitting right, or you've got other issues with the suspension, the first port of call to check really is those rubber bushings and those mounts. So you can get poly mounts for most BMW mounting points. Going too hard on those can be a bit of a problem. You don't want it to be too harsh. They need to have a little bit of give in them to absorb some of the shocks from the road, and they actually work with the suspension setup. And adjusting the camber and the toe setting on the front can actually do a lot to improve cornering, but you've always got a balance there. If you set the camber and the toe too extremely, you're going to ruin the tyre wear and you're going to affect its straight line stability. So it's very much a balancing act, and the wheels are designed to turn into corners and adjust their angle according to the body roll. If you do too much to the suspension, you drop the car too low, you can mess up the whole dynamic alignment of the suspension and the way it works and create some really weird cornering problems. So suspension is best left to someone who actually knows what they're doing. Generally, if you buy a kit that's been designed for your model of car, and we're not just talking about your series, we're talking about your engine, because the engine's weight does come into it. Those diesel engines are quite heavy and they require a whole different suspension setting than the petrol equivalents, just because they're carrying more weight and it works differently when you go into the corners. So if you've got the turbocharged BMWs, so the N54 and N55 are probably two of the most famous turbos out there. They're certainly quite popular. They appeared in our car of the year, the BMW 335. They're absolute monsters. It's interesting to see how a twin scroll single turbo compares to the twin turbo setup. And a lot of people say you can get more power when you tune the twin turbo and replace both turbos. So I suppose that makes sense. You've got two units, you've got more control over the flow rates, you can just go generally bigger. But a larger twin scroll turbo can be just as effective, and the twin scroll technology is much newer. The twin scrolls spool up more quickly and they spin quite nicely, so the power output and profile of the two engines with the two different turbo setups is actually surprisingly similar. And BMW would have opted for the twin scroll turbo because the twin scroll turbo is just one unit, it's cheaper to manufacture, and it's also lighter, so it's got all those advantages. But it was an interesting development in the world of turbos, and it's really nice to see manufacturers using the twin scroll turbo setup on cars where they used to just throw in two turbos.
And we've seen some really impressive diesel engines from BMW. I'll note particularly the 335D, which with a remap can outperform a factory standard M3. And many have claimed that BMW have deliberately detuned the diesels to ensure that the petrol engine still sold well due to the impressive fuel economy that the diesels offered. But whether that claim is true or not, both the diesels and the petrol engines offer a great deal to the tuner if you're prepared to get them remapped and make some adjustments to the turbo.
So replacing any turbo with a larger turbo will make more power, but you need to adjust the mapping, the fueling and the fuel delivery to cope with that. So thinking about the fuel injectors and the fuel pump itself, they are usually the weak spot in cars where you've uprated the turbo. So there's uprated alternatives around that can supply more fuel. different spray patterns on the nozzles of the injectors can actually make a big difference to the engine's efficiency, the way it works, and its ability to burn fuel. So with the exhaust, we see a lot of people talking about going with a catless exhaust or a decat exhaust, or removing the cat from the exhaust. Now that's an illegal mod in pretty much every country now, and in some countries you can't even replace the cat with a better flowing sports alternative. So always check your local regulations when you start doing mods, particularly if you're in the realms of a mod that's going to affect the emissions output of the car. We don't want to put ourselves on the wrong side of the law and end up with penalties, indictments, tickets, and getting cars confiscated and that sort of thing. So every area is slightly different. We're relatively fortunate in the UK because we can use, at the time that this video was recorded, sports cat alternatives that flow much better than the stock ones. But generally with the exhaust and removing the catalysts or the DPFs or replacing them with a sports alternative, all you're doing is removing a restriction. So if there's not a restriction there to start with, you're not looking at a power gain. But typically if you've made dramatic power gains on your BMW, you will be looking at a restriction, and it makes sense to deal with that in the exhaust. We don't usually see very much of a benefit in going cat back. That last bit of the exhaust is more about the sound output, and the systems that BMW fit are actually, generally speaking, pretty good. If you've got an opinion on that, please let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts on which BMWs had good exhausts and which ones need dramatic improvement. But a great way of enjoying the car more is to have a really nice exhaust note behind you. So by all means, if that's what floats your boat, get yourself that sports exhaust. Same also applies to intakes. So induction kits are fitted by people mainly for the induction noise that they give. They're not something that's going to add power to the car. It will remove a restriction in the intake if there is one, and again, in most cases BMW have done a reasonably good job in setting up the intake of the engine, so there's not a lot of power to be gained by going with an induction kit. I would recommend fitting a panel air filter in most models. They are washable, so you just buy it once, you can clean it, and they tend to flow a bit better than the paper ones. So it's a nice little halfway house to going with a better flowing intake without going the full induction kit route. But if you do fit an induction kit, please don't forget to get a cold air feed of air going into that induction kit. If it can be enclosed in a box away from the engine bay, you make more power because that warm engine bay air is carrying less oxygen, and less oxygen means you burn less fuel. So we've done a few measurements, and actually at speed it doesn't make a lot of difference, to be honest. So the cars generally flow a lot of air through the engine bay, so those engine bays do come down when the car is really motoring at say 60 or 70 miles an hour. But if you're doing a dyno run or you're in the lower RPM ranges round town and you want a little bit of extra power, the heat under the bonnet has certainly started to build up, so you're going to be sapping some of that heat. So it really does make sense to just think about improving the intake, but not expecting too much from an induction kit, because it's just not going to happen.
So intercoolers that are fitted by BMW are generally as small as possible, so they suffer from heat soak quite soon. So that's where heat builds up in the intercooler itself, so it becomes less efficient at reducing the intake charge temperature. So that effectively reduces the performance of your engine after a fairly short period of spirited driving. That also applies to turbo diesel engines.
So we've got videos coming up on specific BMW models. We've had a few people already on our channel and emailing us on our site and our forums asking for specific information and videos dealing with engines and the best mods for those. So they're all on our production list. We're working through this quite long production list, but I really want to give you the information that you want. And for some of these engines, I will admit I'm not that familiar with, so I'm doing research on them. I'm talking to people, I'm getting feedback from others, and generally just researching it. So when I do put a video up, you know that it's got good solid research behind it. And please let us know in the comments what you've got, what you would like us to cover in this channel. Please subscribe so you can stay tuned. If you haven't done so already, just hit that subscribe button and you'll be notified of all the new videos as they come out with all these interesting features on other BMW models and BMW specific engine guides. And please throw us up a like. It really helps us to get out there if people like our videos and if people comment on it. So please get involved. This is very much a community effort. I'm really blessed with some great people in our forums, feedback from enthusiastic members of the community, and generally I get on really well with BMW owners. They're just a really nice bunch of car enthusiasts. So thanks for watching this video. See you in the next one.